One of the most significant impacts of World War II was the end of European imperialism in India, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Historians refer to this development as decolonization. Several factors contributed to the end of European imperialism. The aggression of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan had largely discredited imperialist beliefs. Having fought for democracy in Europe, it was hard for the Allies to justify denying democracy to the people of Asia and Africa. Moreover, after World War II, the old colonial powers were exhausted. Most Europeans were not willing to endure further warfare overseas to maintain colonial rule against determined local resistance. Even so, the end of European colonialism was not without bloodshed. The first major country to win its independence from a colonial power was India. The Indian independence movement actually dates back all the way to the 19th century. The Indian National Congress was formed by Hindus in 1885, and in 1919, after peaceful protesters were massacred, there was a renewed outcry for independence amongst Indians. Gandhi, the leader of the Indian National Congress, advocated for a nonviolent approach. Gandhi's nonviolent methods really showed the futility of British rule and the need for Indian independence. Indian independence can be broken down into three categories. The first one is nonviolence. Gandhi preached passive resistance, meaning literally refusing to fight back in any way, shape, or form physically. He counseled Indian people how to resist British beatings and violence. He refused to advocate for violence against the British. The second method was civil disobedience. So Gandhi urged citizens to disobey unjust British laws. In 1930, he led the Salt March to protest the British tax on salt. His followers also fasted or deprived themselves of food and refused to work for British industries. As a result, Indians were jailed in large number for these acts of civil disobedience. The last method that Gandhi employed was building up cottage industries through boycott. Gandhi encouraged Indians to boycott or refuse to buy British-made goods, particularly British cotton goods, and encourage them to make their own cotton materials or clothing. Gandhi hoped that such a method would build up Indian manufacturing and Indian handmade products, which would then raise the standard of living for all Indian people. Indian leaders had hoped for independence shortly after World War I, but were disappointed by British opposition. When World War II broke out, Gandhi refused to support Britain. Despite this, many Indian soldiers fought for the British against the Germans and Japan. After World War II, British leaders recognized that they were too weak to resist Indian demands for freedom. In 1947, Britain agreed to Indian independence. One reason for the British delay in granting independence to India was widespread fear of violence between Hindus and Muslims. Muslim leaders like Muhammad Ali Jinnah told the British they wanted their own Muslim state. Thus, when the British granted independence in 1947, India was partitioned into two separate nations, India and Pakistan. India for the Hindus, Pakistan for the Muslims. Because there was a large Muslim population to the east and west, Pakistan became a divided nation separated by Hindu India. Millions of Hindus and Muslims moved from their homes once independence was granted. Thousands were killed in riots during these migrations. We can't discuss Indian independence without talking about the legacy of Indian independence, which is the partition of the land between the Hindus and the Muslims. And not only just the partition, but the ensuing violence that took place, and the tension that still exists there today. Because ever since 1947, India and Pakistan have not agreed to the region called Kashmir as to who exactly owns it, and there's still violence breaking out between these communities today in 2018. Beginning in the 1500s, most of Southeast Asia had gradually fallen under European control. Europeans were especially attracted by spices such as pepper and cinnamon found in what they called the Spice Islands between the India and Pacific Oceans. In the 19th century, Britain took Burma and the Malay Peninsula, while France took over much of Indochina, which is now Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. In 1898, the Philippines passed from Spanish to American control. In Southeast Asia, only Thailand was able to preserve its independence. As in India, by the 20th century, nationalist ideas had spread to members of the educated elite in Southeast Asia. During World War II, Japan occupied all of Southeast Asia, driving out European powers. After the war, nationalist leaders expected to achieve their independence. In some places, independence was granted peacefully. In others, it was only achieved through warfare. For example, in 1953, Cambodia won independence from France. In 1954, the French in Vietnam suffered a crushing defeat at Dien Bien Phu. The loss broke the will of the French to fight for their empire, and they pulled out of Vietnam. That same year, Laos became independent of France. Other nations also gained their independence. The Philippines, which is an archipelago or group of islands in the Pacific, gained their independence from the United States in 1946. Myanmar, once called Burma, was for many years part of British India. Great Britain granted both Burma and the Malay Peninsula their independence in 1948. Indonesian leaders declared independence in 1945, but they fought with the Netherlands, or the Dutch, until 1949, when the Dutch finally gave them their independence. In Vietnam, guerrilla or guerrilla warfare led by Ho Chi Minh began a war against the French in 1954. At an international conference, Vietnam was split into two. In the north, the communists were led by Ho Chi Minh. In the south, was led by a pro-Western government. You'll learn more about that when we talk about the Cold War. The British had granted Egypt and Saudi Arabia their independence in 1922. However, the British kept troops in Egypt to protect the Suez Canal. Under this arrangement, the King of Egypt was little more than a British puppet. In 1953, the Egyptian king was overthrown by Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser, an Arab nationalist. After World War II, the French granted independence to Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, and to Lebanon and Syria. The independence of Algeria, however, posed greater difficulties. Over 1 million Frenchmen had settled in Algeria. These settlers assumed that one day Algeria would become part of France. Starting in 1954, Algerian nationalists launched a violent struggle for independence. The French army fought the nationalists for almost 8 years. France finally recognized Algerian independence in 1962, and French settlers fled the country. In 1917, the British had promised to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. But decolonization of Palestine and Transjordan under British rule also posed a thorny problem. But the British had limited Jewish immigration to Palestine, and after World War II, it continued to do so to prevent Arab uprising. The British feared that the end to their rule in the area would lead to all-out civil war between the Jews and the Arabs. Finally, the British brought the problem to the United Nations. Further details about the aftermath of the UN's plan for partition, leading all the way up until almost 2018, can be found in the PowerPoints on the Dropbox account. The spirit of nationalism also led to decolonization in Africa south of the Sahara. Even before the war, the British and the French had offered some forms of European education to Africa. The British did this in order to prepare the countries for self-rule, and the French did so that those countries could easily be absorbed into France after World War II. Members of the educated African elite became nationalist leaders that led independence movements. These nationalist leaders were pretty impressed by the promises made by the United States and the British during World War II, that somehow the whole fight for the war was about spreading democracy. Kwame Nkrumah in the British colony of the Gold Coast followed the example of Gandhi by staging demonstrations and boycotting British products. At first, Nkrumah was jailed by the British, but after his release, he was able to win independence for the Gold Coast in 1957. The Gold Coast changed its name to Ghana and became the first Black African colony to win its independence. Over the next decade, over half of all sub-Saharan Africa achieved independence. In some cases, violent conflicts arose between European settlers and native Africans. In other cases, individual tribal groups tried to seed and form new nations. But for the most part, former colonies turned into new states without warfare.